Greetings, friends, and welcome to our world openly with me, your host, Anthony Kalkowski. Today, I had the utmost privilege to speak to Akil Fletcher. Akil Fletcher is a PhD candidate studying social cultural anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, where, in his dissertation, Gaming Blackness, an exploration of Black gaming communities and practices, he explains how online Black communities use digital platforms to form selfhood and relationships in gaming spaces. Based on 2 years of research funded by the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, the NSF-GRFP, National Science Foundation Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant, the NSF-DDRID, and UCI's President's Dissertation Year Fellowship. He explores the lived realities and tactics of navigation taken on by Black gamers. As a digital anthropologist, Akil's work has been published in the Journal of Teaching and Learning Anthropology, the Routledge Companion to Media Anthropology, and the UCI Esports Center. And using this work, Akil has gone on to create new opportunities for youth and students interested in games and esports, such as his work with Dr. Kishana Gray in creating Camp Kiki, a youth camp focused on teaching students about the possibilities for their love of games. Now, I was first inspired to have Akil on when I watched his UC Irvine presentation on his anthropological research on digital worlds, specifically the massive multiplayer online role-playing video game Final Fantasy. In the conversation that we have, we covered how video games relate to topics such as identity, community, economics, race, masculinity, labor in esports, Japanese Europeanness in media, sexual policing and homophobia, hierarchy and egalitarianism in gaming communities, and much more. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy the insightful company of Akil Fletcher as much as I did. All right. Greetings. Today I am with an exciting guest. He is a digital anthropologist. It is Akil Fletcher.
Yes.
So happy to have you on this
Thank you.
podcast. So first, I would like to have us understand maybe what are the variables that drew you into your research as a digital anthropologist, and why specifically focusing on video games and specifically marginalized communities such as the Black community within video games?
Yeah. So, long story short, I got into it for a few reasons, right? So, I grew up as a child of the internet. I had a computer from a very young age. And it was one of those things where my mother was like, it's better that you do this than be on the street. So, she invested all this money into, keeping me indoors with technology for quite a bit, which semi worked. Um, but I spent a lot of time as a kid, gaming on the computer or on the N64. Um, and one of the first times, like once we got, some level of stable internet, which was, dial up and very, very much cost my mom a pretty penny as a, babysitter in Manhattan, taking care of somebody else's kids in a lot of cases, um, meant that nobody was home. It was just me and a computer, and I had unfiltered access to the internet. So I got into a lot of different games, got into, a lot of Korean servers, a lot of things like that. As I got older, it was basically like all I did, whether or not it be Maple Story or guns or anything else. But one of the first times that I experienced like flat out racism, being called the N word, all these other things, wasn't in a store or by police officers, but was actually in the game. And it sat with me for a little bit because as a kid I didn't really understand it, and I was like, why. And it's just whatever else. My parents had sort of walked me through the basics of anti-blackness and other things like that, but it was very glib in a lot of cases. But it was always something that sat with me, and it was something that I always took precautions for in any cases, um when being online in a lot of cases. And that would either end up in arguments or defending myself or going into a lot of things. So when time for me to finally go to college, I started off as a bio major, did a lot of different things, and I worked in a lab for a bit, and I absolutely hated it. So I was like, I am changing my major. Biology is not for me. I guess I will never be the vet that I wanted to be in a lot of cases. But I had fallen in love with anthropology when I was doing my associates at my local community college, actually, back in Brooklyn. Um, so they were like, we don't have an anthro major. You can finish off basically as your standard liberal arts or whatever else, and then when you go into your full undergrad, to a 4-year university, you can find your anthro major there. So I did anthropology, finished off whatever else, went into my BA over at the City College of New York, and continued, just falling in love with anthropology and the sort of work that was being done. In a lot of cases, the classes were just so fun and fascinating. Um, but then it sort of hit me of like, what will I do with this degree when I'm done? And it's I think anthropology is a fantastic major to have, but it does not have an easy answer in terms of like secondary job sourcing or what do you want to do afterwards, right? It's not like, I studied law, so now I become a lawyer. I studied medicine, so now I become a doctor. It's like, do you want to be an anthropologist? And then, like, what does that even mean in a lot of cases? So, after a lot of thought, I was at the time actually leaving a class in a lot of cases. I had my daughter in my third year of college, so my first year of 4-year undergrad at City College, and I was working basically 60 hours plus a week, night shift, doing through multiple stuff. Security was a lot of what I did, to pay for my daughter and my partner, my wife now. Um, and I remember leaving class and I'm just like, I have to go back to work. I hate this job. I'm not happy with what I'm doing right now. So how can I be happy? And realizing that, I've had this deep love and affinity for video games my entire life. And now being equipped with an education and a skill set that I can use to understand why people did the things they did in the games I played and why that happened to me when I was a child in many cases. I sort of put two and two together, and I was like, I'm not going to be a pro gamer, and I hate being on camera, so I'm not going to be a streamer. um, so I'm going to use what I have. I'm you know sharp in some cases. I enjoy, the classroom. I do want to teach in some cases. So it sort of formed themselves there. And I was like, I am going to pursue video games through anthropology and then grad schools. And then I came here. So either way. Or UCI, whoever's watching in cases. But yeah.
Awesome. No, that definitely is a very uh, complex story, I would say. Um, But so with video games specifically, because you could technically, study as an anthropologist, not only video games as a digital anthropologist, but you could
Mm,
also study, for example, streamers.
yeah.
You could study, YouTube culture.
Mhm.
So what drew you even more to go into video games rather than those other cultural aspects?
I mean, so there's a lot there. Well, one, I love video games, so I wanted to make sure that I had a way to interact and continue playing them and do what I wanted to do in many cases. But I also wanted to again understand the communities that form around gaming in a lot of cases. And anthropology for me was the way to do that because the way fieldwork sort of patterns out is that you don't have any sort of like you go in there, obviously you build your project, you go in, you obviously you don't just go in blind and be like, well, today I'm studying gamers, and then just like just join a room and then like this is anthropology. You develop a project, you ask questions, you have your huge sort of itinerary that happens. But the idea is to sort of research narrowly and think broadly in terms of that. You are researching a certain community to gain knowledge that can then be applied into a larger scale in a lot of cases. So it's not unlike any of your like economists or any other things who take small research surveys or sections and then sort of extrapolate that out in a lot of cases. Um, of course, this isn't to say like you're making any sort of assumptions in a lot of cases, but you essentially a big thing in anthropology is that there's no universals, and every little small thing that you understand can sort of help you get to that understanding in many cases. So researching smaller communities serve a big purpose in understanding the human experience and understanding how things aren't all the same, but are in many cases different, right? Um, so with understanding like not going into streamers or the YouTubers in a lot of cases, when you go into your field site, even though you have this, entire research agenda, you have to be open to the fact that things will not be the way that you think they are when you go in. So you might think like, for my research, it was largely understanding the sort of navigational practices of Black players. How do their identities form? How do they form community? How do they understand gaming spaces and avoid racism in a lot of cases? Um, that doesn't mean that there are Black individuals who don't think racism exists, or have many differing opinions from the sort of ideas that you went in having, and you have to be open to that. So even with studying video games, it meant that I was studying a lot of other things because it sort of spirals out in a lot of cases. And you do have to sort of put your arms around it and hold on where you can. But it meant that I did interview streamers. I did interview developers. I did interview a bunch of different people who were gaming adjacent, right? Because again, they were playing video games. They were gamers. They were Black folks who were making the wonderful art and communities that I wanted to study and understand. So it's gaming is the focus, but it's really about the people, and they can do anything. People do whatever they want. Yeah.
Yeah, with anthropology, it is always this. It's interesting how ethnography, which is the method for which a lot of
Yeah.
anthropologists do their studies, how it does differ from different social science
Yeah.
methods, taking this more less universal approach, like you mentioned. Um, in tandem with that, could you explain to me and our audience how exactly does your field work, your research look like in a kind of painting us a picture
Yeah.
of what the daily life of a digital researcher in Final Fantasy, because that's mostly the field work that you were doing,
Mhm.
looks like.
So I mean, fieldwork looks different from everybody, and it's one of those bigger issues with anthropology, and that it is not reproducible, right? Which is a lot of the arguments of anthropology being a science or not being a science, and I don't care either way.
Mm.
I enjoy what I do, because of that lack of reproducibility, right? Because when I spend a day in Final Fantasy, that would be very different from what you would do spending a day in Final Fantasy, right? The people you meet different, your experiences would be different. So a lot of the when you are an anthropologist, you are the tool of research, right? You are in a sense both limited, and in a lot of ways it's a great thing in many cases, but by like the for what you can discover and what you can find and who you can speak to in a lot of cases, right? It's not like a survey that goes out there and everybody else answers. So for me, in a lot of cases, it would be identifying who it is I wanted to speak to, which was a lot of, looking through Black groups, finding Black individuals to speak to, spending a lot of time in these spaces because there's always the chance that, this is not in fact a Black group. And in fact, a bunch of white kids just decided to troll somebody. Um, and spending time with the people. So it's playing games with them. Waking up at 4 a.m. For the new expansion release when Endwalkers came out. We were all up at like 3 a.m. Well, they were up at like 6 because a lot of people I was thinking with were on the East Coast, but I was up at 3 a.m. to my dismay. Um, playing games, recording my entire day session. Just gaming for 12 to 18 hours taking notes, reading through, literature, looking through what individuals were doing, and making sure that I can be a part, as much of a part of the events that were going on, to catch what I could catch, because that is literally how you make your data, right? If you're not there to see it, then it becomes very difficult for you to use it. And in a lot of cases, again, you are limited by your research tool, and that's me. So I have to be there. Um, if you want a literal step by step, it's like, roll out of bed, do whatever I have to do, and then get down and get to my computer, headphones on, see who's on, and then play. In a lot of cases, it can really look different depending on what the day is. Sometimes it was full community engagement. Sometimes there'd be 10 people on who wanted to raid, or do something else, or play other games like that, and it was switching from game to game, or playing Final Fantasy and grinding. Or it was just me, like, experiencing the story, in the off hours when people weren't on, and playing through it, so I knew what the conversations were about, and I had a character
Mm.
and a individual who was of a high enough level to compete in to participate in the more end game content, which a lot of them were like big raiders, a lot of them were big, um how do I put this, like, they wanted to tackle the more difficult content.
Mhm.
And in order for me to get a good understanding of that, that took like a lot of practice and a lot of engagement on that. And I had one of them coach me to be able to, like, they have something called a rotation when you do spells, um to get down the right rotations, to be able to learn the fights, to be able to do things, because I had picked a class that was a little bit difficult for newer content. It was a black mage, and it meant that a lot of my time was spent both engaging with the community, and then making sure that I had the skills to engage with the community. Because
Mhm.
if you suck, they will kick you out very quickly.
Mhm.
So you have to be good at it in that case. But yeah.
That's fascinating. So, in a sense, in order to do your research, you had to labor within these digital spaces. You had to not only get good at, doing the rating, understanding the mechanics between raids, and just for our audience that may not know what raids are, these are certain, or maybe if you could just give us a quick brief on what Final Fantasy itself is and what raids are, and maybe what storyline within Final Fantasy is, and yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think with that, it might also just be useful to sort of explain my research, and then
Mhm,
Final Fantasy in that case. Um, so, like I said before, what I do is I study sort of Black navigational practices and community. I want to understand how Black individuals form community in gaming, since what a lot of them see as gaming communities or gaming spaces is anti-black, right? There's so much discrimination, there's so much racism, vitriol, anti-blackness that happens within a lot of these spaces, in part because gaming has been seen as a sort of pastime for white teens in their basement, and because the internet does give a level of anonymity, excuse me, to allow people to say and do whatever they like in some cases, with middling repercussions in a lot of cases. But what that means is that it's a prime place for individuals to experience racism. If you are um, familiar with like T-Pain or any other of the black streamers that you might have seen on YouTube complaining about it, right? There's so many different ways that people express racism and do all these other things online. Like when he was playing Call of Duty, for any of you who don't know, it's a game, guns, wars. You shoot people, but this game is infamous for having racist chat lobbies, and lots of cases where T Pain, a famous individual, was called the N word, and all these individuals had fun at his expense, not knowing, probably not even knowing that they were playing with a famous musician in a lot of cases. But it's such a normal part of gaming while black that a lot of us will adopt certain aspects and behaviors in order to avoid this, whether or not it's keeping your mic off, or changing your in-game name, or not playing as a black person, or doubling down and being you know I hate all these races and whatnot, and making sure that your blackness is on full display, which comes with its own issues and threats and possibilities in a lot of cases. So my work is largely to understand all of that, and to see the ways in which that they are circumventing, right, the racism in gaming to create new possibilities of just gaming being a wonderful and beautiful place for Black people to exist, because many of us have been playing it for so long, and as one of my interlocutors pointed out, right, she wasn't going to give way or abandon a space that she grew up with, or and a hobby that she grew up loving and playing, just because some people on the internet refuse to let her enjoy her time in peace in some cases, right? So with that being said, marking what my research is, it then came down to developing my project and going where I needed to go. Um, and I sent out a survey to see what people were playing. I took note of other gaming groups that I had been in through either personal or for preliminary research that I had conducted a few summers ago, uh, to sort of narrow down what I wanted to work on and where I wanted to research, because I can't obviously research every game in existence. I can't play Fortnite and Call of Duty and League of Legends and Final Fantasy and have a sort of coherent project in a lot of cases. But in some cases, that's what people do. So I focused my project on the people. So whatever they played, I played. And it so happened that three of the main groups that I was researching at the time were like Final Fantasy, Endwalkers is coming out, which is an expansion for the game. And we are like, we're going to be playing this. And I was like, okay, I'll bite the bullet. I was not planning to get into an MMORPG or a massive multiplayer online role playing game where you choose a character from a bunch of Tolkien X races. So your orcs, your elves, things like that. Final Fantasy has a little bit of twist on that. Like the elves are Elysian. The what would I guess normally be dwarfs are or gnomes in this case is the Lalafell. Um, and it's a game that takes all the history of Final Fantasy and puts it into a online playable experience. So if you are familiar with Final Fantasy and you've played literally anything from the original Final Fantasy to Crystal Chronicles to 13, which has a whole bunch of people different opinions and things like that. You have all these references and lore and worlds and build up into the land of Eorzea, which is what you enter in Final Fantasy 14. You pick a character and you play this game, exploring this massive world with thousands of other players, and it can be a wonderful experience in a lot of cases, right? So I do have other games that I research, like League of Legends and stuff like that, which we can talk about. But Final Fantasy was one of the big ones. Um, and yeah, because it's an MMORPG, there's a couple of staples to the genre that you can play through. Raiding is one of them, where you get together with 7 to 8 to 10 different players, sometimes four, depending if it's a dungeon or whatnot. And you tackle usually some large beast or monster or boss that you have to work together with these individuals in very specific ways to take down. So it's common to people to form friendships or form communities that are based on taking this stuff down, or you just do things like form a workers union and hire a bunch of people to host parties, or you start your DJ career by DJing on Twitch, specifically within Final Fantasy, and working for in-game and out of game currency, so that you can experience, or that you can get your music out in a different unique way. You can do so many other things than say raid or fight monsters or be the hero of the story, because Final Fantasy isn't just a game. In many cases it is a literal virtual world, and just like the physical world, you can do more than wake up and do your job, right? So there's so many possibilities in the game that it's almost limitless. um yeah, and it's great in that way, and it meant that I can research so many other things, but specifically on rating, after I got through all of that long story or whatever else. Yeah, like I said, rating is a bunch of folks going in to beat up a big monster, and it takes practice. There are some raids that took me like 2 weeks to beat because people did not know the fight, or I would die, or something else would happen. So it takes a lot of practice and training, and there's so many like maps and formations and placing down numbers, and it's a real it's like a sport. There's a lot to go. But yeah, if that answers that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great way to showcase the research and what Final Fantasy rating would look like. I'd love if you could also expand on how the storyline of Final Fantasy relates to your research. You did mention how it was you had to learn the storyline just to keep up with dialogue with
Yeah.
interlocutor.
Yeah, so spoilers are not something people take kindly. The Final Fantasy 14 is different from other MMORPGs. So, you have games like WoW, who obviously has like a deep, rich lore in a lot of cases. And my God, one of my a lot of the MMORPGs I've played have been like Maple Story and other ones. But WoW, using WoW as another good example, right? The lore
WoW for our audience, just if you don't know, is
world of yeah.
yes, World of Warcraft.
Yes. I'm using lingo. I'm sorry. Either way. World of Warcraft, right? There's always been something with MMORPGs or specifically within like consistently standing virtual worlds, and that the lore is something more that you tend to uncover. It's something that you play through quest by quest in a lot of cases. But Final Fantasy has always been by design a narrative game. So you would always play through the story, you would be the hero in whatever cases, and then, you start off with saving the cat, and then by the end, you're slaying God. um, so with the online game, what the producers, well, Final Fantasy has its own long, fascinating history, which is definitely worth looking into if anybody wants to. But with 14, once Naoki Yoshida or Yoshi P took over, right, there's always a sort of discussion of how do we take the narrative of Final Fantasy and then make that into a huge online experience. So a lot of what the team basically came up with was you have the main story that you can play through, whether or not you want to do it by yourself, with friends in a lot of cases. But it's largely a independent or solo experience. Um, and that story sort of opens up the pathways for you to be able to do the content. So you play through the story, it opens a dungeon. You go through that dungeon with people. You don't all watch the cutscene at the same time, but sometimes you'll be sitting there for 25 minutes watching these individuals have high political conversation of why it's okay to take over one person's land because the individuals who hold it currently colonized or ousted it from another inhuman race. So it's like, why are you mad, bro? Like you colonized, we're doing the same thing. There's a lot of there's a lot of nuance to the story, which is great. But understanding that story for a lot of people, it's a real big investment. People are really, really, really stand by the story of Final Fantasy 14. It's one of the biggest reasons why they play the game and continue to play the game. So yeah, there's the competitive stuff, there's the rating and all that other stuff, but people really do want the story, and they there's a lot of attachment to it. So if I didn't know it, one, there was a chance of me being spoiled because I got attached to it, or B, I just couldn't do the content that was attached to that story or available. Because if I didn't beat the game, then you can't do end game content. And
Yeah.
then, that's really where the real game starts is your end game and fashion and all these other things that happen. So yeah.
So the knowledge was, in a sense, a prerequisite to unlock the ability to move forward within this digital world, but also to communicate with your study research participants. Um, so you mentioned about how there's these almost economies being structured within your community that you're studying.
Mhm.
You mentioned how they're making almost worker co-ops or not co-ops, but or employing other individuals within raids. So I'm wondering, how does the economy look within the groups that you're studying, and whether or not certain systems of the mainstream, as in our current times capitalism, how does that permeate into these digital spaces that are supposed to be these almost purified, separated forms?
So, I mean, something to understand about games right off the back is that they're not vacuums, right? Everything you interact with in the real world can and often does show up in game spaces because they're worlds of imagination, and sometimes humans aren't that imaginative. What you do in the real world, you'll try to recreate there. Um, about the economy specifically, that tends to be more of a Final Fantasy specific question. So there is a delineation between the individuals that I'm studying and Final Fantasy itself, and they both are researched in many cases and in many ways. But it's more about how the communities interact in the economy rather than forming the economy themselves, because the economies within Final Fantasy are formed game wide, and we are like anybody in any economy, right, are just participants to the sort of invisible hand motions that are happening, which are not as invisible as people would like to think. But the economies within the game are fascinating simply because they influence how what people want to do and how they interact. So in order to keep up with content in a lot of cases, you need raids. You need armor, you need gear, you need things, right? Because these are virtual worlds. They do their best to facilitate or recreate aspects of your physical day life. And in order to do things, you need to buy things, you need to have things already. And that's just part of the way that MMOs tend to work. You get your armor, then you have to say, you basically ask yourself, how do I get this armor? Whether or not it's through questing, you can do something like farming, where you run the same dungeon again and again and again until you get the armor that you need, or you can buy it. Once you enter that buying it section, that creates a market for whatever it is you're trying to buy, whether or not, let's say, randomly a piece of helmet, like the helm of Gilgamesh or whatever, right? That's not the game. Maybe it's, but I'm just making that up, right? The helm of Gilgamesh is a busted item that everybody has because everybody wants, because it's the best way that you can output damage. It means that you can finish these quests faster, and that means you can get a bunch of other things faster, right? So if this is a sellable item, it's going to go for a lot of money. That means you have to get yourself money. And in a lot of cases in Final Fantasy, there is lots of different ways of side hustling. You can get a trade. You can basically work like an apothecary, or you can you can craft armor. You can make potions. You can do a bunch of other things, and then you can put these items on the sort of global market for Final Fantasy, and then you can sell them to actual people who needs these potions because it helps you run dungeons, or needs these armors in many cases, or you can just sell the equipment, the sort of ingredients that you gather, as a way to make money to then buy that armor, or to buy whatever mount or whatever else you want to spend money on in the game. But what's fascinating is that people have found these unique ways to break away from your standard in-game currency engagement and create their own markets through role play or through any sort of creative play aspect. And that shows up in a lot of different ways. There was an article quite a while ago about brothels in Final Fantasy and prostitution, where through for sexual role play in a lot of these cases, which usually takes on the form of a sort of typical role play where you find a private room, you dress, you talk sexy, or in a lot of cases it also includes mods, which will remove the clothes from the characters and other things like that, which is not allowed by Square in any cases. But you don't say anything, they have no way of knowing in a lot of cases. Um, and then you will make money that way, right? Because it's like 50,000 gil a session, then here you go. Or
Mm.
it's you may have a party in a lot of cases. One of the individuals that I hung out with a lot was a bouncer slash bartender slash hype man for a DJ who DJ'd in the real world, but did his DJ through stream while hosting in-game parties, right? So he would get hired to attend a party, or to perform at a party. You would turn on your stream, his music would be playing, which is not in-game music in any case. It's all of your favorite artists, whatever else playing. It was a fairly good DJ as well. You would engage with that while dancing and having fun in housing or properties that in game that people set up, right? So you would have this great like party time or whatever else. And this individual got hired by the DJ and his crew, more or less, to work as an in-game hype man, to do things like use popping bottle emojis, or dancing emojis, or lighting emojis, or just to sort of like control the party in a lot
Mhm.
of cases, because there are in-game limitations to what you can and can't do, and they want to do their best to recreate a physical party
Mm.
in a lot of cases. So it's really just a bunch of people who want to have a good time with their friends that they've made in Final Fantasy, and they're entertaining this. And to make money, he's like, I will work for you for 3 hours. I will be this hype man. I will use this pop bottle champagne emoji to hype people up, and the music will be playing from Twitch and all these other things. And it's so fascinating how that physical world and digital world will interact in many cases, because it opens up whole new sets of possibilities of whatever you can imagine. there's a way to make it happen, right?
Mhm.
And you just have to work around the affordances of the game in order to play with it. So like one of his jobs was telling everybody to put away their weapons, right? Because that breaks the what's the word, the immersion
Mm.
of the party in many cases, because you're not there to slay beasts, you're not there to play the game. We're trying to treat this as its own sort of hollowed space. Um and it another thing is just like weapons and pets and any other little gear and add-ons that you have literally take up physical space. Like they take up, well, not physical but digital space within it, right?
Mhm.
So if the building can say manage 300 people before it shuts down or starts lagging or these other things, um if you have a pet out, that's adding to the to the data, that's taking a bet. So you want to remove your pet, you want to take off the weapons to allow more individuals to be able to run the game smoothly without having their systems overwhelmed by the amount of people that's in there, as well as both breaking the immersion of the mind and the immersion of the game itself. So it's fascinating in that case.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. And these digital limitations, then it does put a kind of it imposes a sort of reality onto the digital space, even though we perceive digital spaces as being unlimited.
Mm,
You have these, for example, like you mentioned, the data. You have to take out the pets from so that the party or the groups of individuals can run the game smoothly.
mhm.
And you also mentioned about this kind of recreating of the physical space within the digital space through these parties and through also jobs that are
Mm,
modern jobs.
mhm.
Even in a game like Final Fantasy, which has a lot of medieval kind of elements to it with swords and armor and potions
Yep.
and apothecaries. I am very interested in how you see the dynamics of politics play out within the groups that you study. So, for example, do you see any tensions between a desire to organize in an egalitarian fashion within a
Mm.
raid or pulling with desires to organize in a more hierarchical fashion?
So that really depends on the space. So I did work with a couple of groups in a lot of cases, and some were definitely, if it were a sort of like smaller friend group of like 7 to 10 people, there tend to be a little bit more egalitarian aspects in many cases. But everybody has disagreements, arguments break out, things happen in a lot of cases. There were some days some people didn't want to play because somebody wasn't performing the way they need to perform in that raid or dungeon. They didn't do enough damage, and that became a whole other thing. We had to coach people, other things like that. But in terms of like larger groups that I spent time with on sites like Facebook or Twitter or in cases, or even like in larger companies within the, well, company guild, depending on the game you want to say, basically a grouping of people that all sort of like work under the same banner, or play under the same banner within the game. There were definitely hierarchies in many aspects, and whether or not it was the literal hierarchy of I am the developer of this space, I'm an administrator and thus I have more power than you. There are things that you can say or can't say that I can censor, which is a literal power within some of these black spaces. There was also the sort of invisible hierarchies that exist very much within the physical world that are then recreated within such, specifically around like the LGBT community and women within the spaces. Of a good example of being like desire and sexuality, right? Where some of these spaces would consistently sexualize women in a lot of cases because there was a lot of men in these spaces, and they're just like, well, we all like looking at women, blah 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 blah, let's show that. But then when a woman or a gay individual puts up, say, a sexy image of a man or something else like that, um it very quickly would spiral out into like a lot of hate and a lot of anger and things like that. Be like, I don't want to put this on, I don't want to see that, blah 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 blah, sort of things. So it became very obvious of like who had the say of like what was okay to sexualize and what wasn't okay, like whose sexualities got to be explored in within these spaces in a lot of cases. And that would recreate itself in a lot of cases when like in gameplay, when these individuals did shift from like say Discord community to in-game community. If somebody wanted to wear like a dress, they had near automata event or whatever a while back where you could get the 2B dress. If you like, if you're not familiar with the game, it doesn't matter. Just imagine a black dress that you can put on, but the dress was not edited for gender. They didn't offer you like a pants outfit for, men or women within the game, which is often what Final Fantasy will do. They'll gender their clothing very heavily. But this is one of the few pieces that both men and women can wear equally. You can put on a dress in a lot of cases. And if members wanted to wear that dress, they definitely got clowned on, right? It was they got made fun of, they got engaged with, and it was sort of it would mark the sort of hierarchical standards of like what is acceptable in these spaces and who got to do stuff, because there were some people that like if they put on the dress it just didn't matter because they were more or less in charge and you weren't going to fight that, and some people who were just like, well, hey bro, what are you doing, in a lot of cases. And it's fascinating to research individuals that you just have fundamental disagreements with. I got into a lot of arguments with a lot of the spaces that I was in about the existence of trans people, the gay rights, things like that. And it was one of those examples that just because it's a black space doesn't mean that it lacks discriminatory practices in a lot of cases, which is a thing. But there's definitely, I would, some spaces were super egalitarian and super lovely and did what they had to do to the best of their ability, but hierarchies often would stem in some way out in many cases, even within pure black spaces that wanted to attempt to leave a lot of that. So it depended.
I
Yeah.
see. That's a great kind of funneling into the discussion of masculinity within
Mm.
these Black communities. And so, if you could describe to me how masculinity intersects within these communities, and also, I know you did a great research or great, you pointed out some great things about the bunny boy race within Final Fantasy. So, if you could also talk about that, that would be amazing.
Yeah. So um masculinity plays a big role in the identity of the gamer overall. There is wonderful work. I'm trying to pull the name out of my head, but I am blanking. I will find it. Don't worry. But there's wonderful work talking about the linking between gaming technology and masculinity, right? Because when you think about computers, you think about the sort of spaces that games were built up in. First and if we're talking about computer games and like university spaces that were largely controlled by men, white men specifically in these cases, and then shifting to like arcade spaces, which were seen as spaces for men to go to. Well, usually young boys. There's a wonderful linking of techno masculinity, which is the exact term. I just have to find the name now. It's her work is great, but the book is called Coin Operated Americans, and I will find that name. Trust me. But that being said, techno masculinity is a term from Coin Operated Americans of just like how gaming has sort of funneled into this like hyper masculine space, right? Where people think that gaming is now associated with boyness or menness in a lot of cases, which is ironic because once games made the shift from arcade spaces, which could have easily been marked as masculine spaces, um, into the domestic sphere, into the homes, which was typically seen as the space of women in many cases. There had to be a sort of propagandic move and sort of selling the idea that it was cool for men to be at home now, right?
Mm.
There's a lot of movement from the arcade space to the console space in the home um, for that. But lo and behold, all of that worked. And games are now seen as the pastime of men, and whether or not you want to go to the TikToks where it's like this is all we have, get the e-girls out of here, the disrespect that's women streamers will serve or receive, or just the idea that they get more views because they're women, even though the top streamers aren't, there's hardly any women within the top 10 streamers, Pokimane being, I think, the only one or the only exception. There might be another, I have to double check. But the majority of top streamers are made up by white men. So none of that holds to data, but people still make the claims because it is anecdotal and it is just what they feel in a lot of cases, and it's also marked by a lot of internal misogyny or misogynoir in a lot of cases, specific towards black work. But because of that, you know, masculinity just plays a big role for anybody that lives in the US in a lot of cases, and it looks very different from place to place. And white masculinity will look very different from black masculinity, as well as have different impetuses which, you know, form that masculinity in the first place. So it was something that I dealt with a lot in a lot of these spaces, especially ones that were mostly made up by men who felt it was okay to be misogynistic or to make the most stereotypical aspects of masculinity their personality.
Hmm.
With that being said, then it was just interesting to deal with, right? Because one, I didn't care for it, so it started a lot of arguments in a lot of cases, but also understanding that, you know, hyper masculinity within the black community has had a very different history, largely because uh, emasculation or demasculation of men was a part of slavery and a part of the consistent experience of black men in America during Jim Crow, during segregation, during these other aspects, you know, whether or not it was the calling of boy or these other aspects in many cases, and even, you know, throughout the separation of families, you know, through over policing and all those other things, like these aspects targeted men to make them feel less like men and other things. And you have in result something called a cool pose, where it's a sort of overcompensation for years and years and years of demasculation for these black men. So they overcompensate in a lot of ways, and a part of you wants to be understanding to that, of just like, hey, you are dealing with years of, you know, structural harm that has sort of caused this in many cases, whether or not it be the sort of stereotypical um hip hop persona or gangster in many cases, or other stuff like that. All these identities are sort of responses to that, you know, the need to protect oneself, especially since literally gangs were formed as forms of protection, not as forms of, not what other people would have you believe, in terms of just like, we just like crime, so crime's gonna happen. No. But that being said, right, that means that there's a direct history there that differentiates black masculinity from white masculinity, which my white masculinity is often a means of controlling or have or maintaining power, literally being it from either the means of controlling land, of controlling feminine women or feminine bodies, um, or just, you know, maintaining any sort of power, whether or not it be political or socially, in any of these cases. Meanwhile, black masculinity was is a way to hold on or fight back for what they have, and it's toxic for a reason. It's deleterious in many ways, but it's very difficult to tell somebody who is scared of being murdered to take the knife out of their hand when the person walking towards them has done them harm for so long. Um, and it just made for so many fascinating conversations within the space, because I couldn't outright tell them that, like, you're wrong, which many of them were in some cases, because, you know, sometimes sometimes this masculinity is very directly linked towards the LGBT or queer experience, in the case of just like a lot of them being straight was them identifying what is gay, right? They had
Hmm.
to have such an intimate knowledge of, for them, what was homosexual, to be able to not do that, right? So it
Hmm.
became an entire skewing of anything that was gay, and this wraps up entirely in terms of like engaging with trans identity, with engaging with the LGBT community in lots of cases. And I, thankfully, most of the people I interacted with were open to most of the stuff. But, you know, within the larger group, I you can't talk to everybody, but there's always the differentiation of, like, you know, this is a black group, not a gay group. Um, ignoring the fact that, you know, there are gay black
Hmm.
people, there are, you know, queer black people, there are trans black people that exist, and it sort of shows the limiting of what they believe the black identity to be, and not making room for a lot of cases, which sort of form that hierarchy aspect that I was talking about, of like, what forms of blackness is the premier blackness that you want to put out there
Hmm.
in many of these cases. But with the bunny boys that you were asking about, um bunny boys are another race, or, you know, the Viera are another race within Final Fantasy that has a reputation of being more feminine or uh, softer in a lot of cases for a lot of individuals because their lore writes them as the secondary aspect or of the non-warrior aspect of their race. So within their race, the women are in charge. They have the rule of their communities. They go out to do the hunting. Right. It was sort of like an in-game explanation as well, because when the race Vieira came out at first, it was just the women. And then when people started asking and begging for male Vieira, they basically had to write a reason for why there was no male Vieiras. And it was
Mm,
like basically male Vieiras stay within the community. They're more shy. They're more docile. They're not as outgoing, so they're very rarely seen. And
mm,
then now they are somewhat entering out because of the interactions of the world and the wars that are going on and all these other things, yada yada yada. But with this lore, with this other thing, and the fact that bunny boys is just not like a bunny isn't a typical intimidating animal like a dragon in many cases or other stuff like that. So it really did come down to it was really interpreted as like this sort of like feminine pretty boy in a lot of cases. Um and for a lot of my black interlocutors who are trying to maintain or reestablish their masculinity in these cases, they did not want to play as bunny boys because it was seen as effeminate, right? So it was just interesting and fascinating. And I brought it up in that talk because it's like their black identities are being shaped not just by the sort of racial formations that happened hundreds of years ago, in terms of identifying the human and the non-human as marking black as non-human and white as human in many cases, but was being marked by their own personalities and identities, whether or not for better or worse, which included their sexual identification, their gendered identity, all these other things. Because for them, the bunny boys weren't black because it was more or less like what self-respecting black man would be a bunny boy, which is hogwash.
mm.
But it is fascinating to see the ways in how they marked their black identities by their masculinity, right? They needed to be men, black men first and foremost, and the bunny identity just didn't mark with that. So,
Hmm. That's very interesting. I know that in another MMO RPG, World of Warcraft, they have this race called the Blood Elves, and they look very also, I guess, feminine
mm,
in their appearance. And there's also this weird community dynamic in which, if you play as a Blood Elf, they're seen as again feminine and kind of less than because of it, and you're not a true if you play as a male. Of course, if you play as a female, you're just immediately sexualized, and
yeah.
you're roped into ERPG, if
Mm,
ERP, erotic role play.
mhm.
um and so it's fascinating how between different games you can see similar dynamics, but of course here it's more of a focus on the black community with a very specific definition of masculinity, I guess.
Yeah.
um I am also interested in how the masculinity of the black community, how that can intersect with this need for possibly establishing hierarchy, if that is at all correlated within the community. If you've noticed,
Mhm.
if you haven't, that's also
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot to say on hierarchy in a lot of cases. Ironically, with the blood elf thing, it's funny that you say that because a lot of the individuals that I spoke to, like around the time WoW was getting big again, especially like WoW Classic or Vanilla WoW, in a lot of cases, the blood elves weren't so much seen as effeminate within the black community, but they were seen as the quote unquote like master race, right? They like
Mm,
the this is of course in jest, right? They're not the literal master race, but like they are basically your World of Warcraft Nazis, right? So it was anytime somebody had to play as one or things because they long live the horde and all that other things, right? There aren't as many options because if you play um on the oh my god, I'm forgetting the other side. But if you play on the other side, obviously the popular ones are like the night elf, the pretty ones, things like that. I was a fan of the worgen because I love werewolves, but um the blood elves were just like, yeah, these are just like WoW's like premier races. They're into, and they're in, and that's very, again, that's very lore specific. They are entirely about the purity of their blood and
Hmm.
keeping and maintaining themselves, outside of other, forest elves and all these other things. So it's just like, yeah, I play as the the master race in all these other cases. But yeah, with in terms of hierarchy and masculinity, it's funny, right? Because you can notice these sort of like invisible hierarchies that I spoke about before, right? In terms of like the gender, sexuality, the identity, the class, all these things that pop up um within the space overall. But there was also a level of vulnerability in a lot of these like smaller groups that I hung out in, right? The ones of 10 people or whatever else, where their where even though they pull down so specifically on this masculinity, there was a flirt or sort of swaying in and out of like what your typical hardback black man would essentially be, because a lot of these spaces were spaces for them to be vulnerable, right? This is the spaces that they would speak about trauma from family, relationships with their dad, problems with wives, or other things like that, right? So it wasn't, I would say it was, for the smaller ones at least, it was less, hierarchical and more supportive in that case, because once they all understood that, like, ha ha ha, I'm a man, and this is what men do, it slowly started to break down. Um, once they sort of like did their chest puffing and to more vulnerability for themselves, and it was just there was just a lot of how do I put it? A lot of paradoxical behavior going on in many cases. And then even then there's like I mentioned, right, the understanding of what is queer behavior in a lot of cases for them. Like there was tons of you know just flat out homosexual behaviors in some cases that they would think like random like random jokes of jest of just like the over sexualization within gameplay, like the classic like I'm gonna rape you in some cases, in many cases, just for like, you'll be like, "Oh, I'm gonna put it in your butt," or all these other things, or these other, it's just like these little things that like, if you're this big, you know, if you are this defined strong black man, where does anal play all of a sudden come from? And in some cases, or even just like, where does the flirtation or other things that go around, or like, oh, he kind of cute, like that is that's different. So great. I'm happy for you. I hope you do. It's fine in any case. But like you were just saying, all of these like, you've defined yourself this way, and now you're engaging in this way. So it's data. In any case, but yeah.
I think that really showcases just how performative masculinity is. And
Mhm.
while I think it's over time, would you agree with the statement that over time within these communities, as they got to know each other, that kind of performance was dampened due to just feeling less threatened? Because when you're meeting new people, especially if you've been a marginalized community that has been emasculated, like you talked about, there's this kind of threat perception, right?
Mhm.
That you need to showcase your toughness in
Mhm.
order to survive and not be harmed. So maybe as time went on, that they felt more comfortable within the group that they were in, and they felt less inclined to perform this defense mechanism of masculinity.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot there, and I think you're partially right in a lot of cases. So masculinity is literally performance, right? Whether or not you want to go to gender performance and things, not to pull out Judith Butler's work or anything else like that, right? Of gender being performance, and there's a lot of credit, right, to this theory, and there's also a lot of pushback in a lot of cases. But yeah, masculinity, especially in today's terms, is a sort of performative aspect, and it's one that people perform and perform and perform to make their identity. um it's also important to remember that the sort of hyper masculine, cool pose black identity is also, sorry, is also not something people choose to do, but something, that has been built up over, years and years and years of abuse, right? Some
Hmm.
people, like, sometimes you don't understand the ways that you behave, right? And it's just the way it is. But yeah, with time and with interactions and other stuff, like, they started to treat each other like family, and there was still, the homophobia and other things like that that existed, but it became okay to sort of like play at the margins. It came to play at the edges in so many cases where, if somebody like says like, oh, this hot male elf, they'll be like, oh, he kind of cute, whatever else, right? People will be like, hey yo, or scream out or do whatever the typical, like, pause or any other sort of like black interaction of just like when homophobia is like clearly stated, because like you have to pause, recognize what you said, say no homo, whatever, blah 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 blah, which is all nonsense. It's in a lot of cases, but it's it does show like that's not something they would have willingly done with a group of strangers in any cases, right? The walls will stay up, and that's different from person to person, and in any cases, I got a chance to engage and play with tons of queer black gamers in a lot of cases, and it was very different interactions. But for the straighter, more masculine performing individuals, it was, yeah, it was like over time, once I get to know you, we can engage, we can start, talking about more personal things, whether or not they be sexual, whether or not they be other stuff. There was a hilarious and fascinating a conversation rather, about the male G spot being in the anus, right? So, um, obviously, true in many cases, and the whole conversation was just like, is it worth it to experience like the best climax that you can if it means having to go past the nowhere zone? Plenty of them were like, no, 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 that's not it. But like, I'm not gonna do that. And things, and the other ones were just like, well, maybe like, if it's a girl doing it, like, how is that gay? And it's like, it's funny to see like how the line will move depending from individual to individual, like what is and is not. And it's just like, they're like, yo, this is either super gay, not gay, kind of gay. It's thing, but it's just queer identity just lives so rent free in the heads of black men, because again, like, their masculinity is defined by not engage, like, not crossing into that aspect. So they have to find the line, and then they just start moving it randomly. So it doesn't matter. But yeah.
That's actually really funny. It's philosophizing about how to negotiate, boundaries.
Mm,
I'm also interested in what you mentioned a while back. You mentioned how you like to play, in when you used to play World of Warcraft, you like to play, the Origin race, right?
mhm,
So I know that you talked about how, for example, one way in which the black community, certain individuals in the black community navigate the lack of uh, races that portray a kind of black individual,
mhm,
superficially,
yeah.
physically, how they will then attempt to uh, take that superficial blackness and um, emanated through a animalistic race. For example, you mentioned a tiger race, a tiger humanoid
Mhm.
race, and if you could just talk about how this and this combination of the animal with the human allows certain black individuals to express their blackness within these digital spaces.
Yes. So first, I remember the name of Coin Operated. Carly Korsarick. Great work. Check out the book. Do what you like. Okay. So that being said, um, yeah. So it's not so much like black individuals finding their identity specifically through a bestialization or other things like that, but rather Final Fantasy 14's affordances of blackness being limited to the fact that they had to go out there and find these aspects. And yes, sometimes this was in this sort of like animalistic or beast identity.
Oh yeah.
But it's so all right, so a lot of the talk I gave was the sort of like reforming blackness, right? The ways in which blackness can sort of take root and be shaped without having to be phenotypically black, right? um because blackness isn't just about what the skin color you have or the identity. In a lot of cases, it is in some cases because that was the marker, but about the culture, about the identity, about the person, right? And blackness has not only become a culture, but taken on more of a personal identity, and it has become the question for many black individuals is how do I be black without the definition or the marking of of a black identity that was created by white individuals, right? How do you separate the two and be, blackness without its comparison to whiteness and just, be. Um and for a lot of my interlocutors, it was fascinating because for them the answers in that case was to take on forms of identity that had nothing to do with phenotypical blackness and related more to the person of whether or not it was a Leo or their their gendered identity or their masculine identities or the other cases because their blackness was defined by these aspects rather than just their skin color. So within Final Fantasy 14, you can have brown skin, and it looks different for every race in a lot of cases, but because of the not only the game's affordances, but there's often a lack of I don't want to say care. I wasn't there when they made the game in many cases, but there's a lack of options, right? For in many cases, and then this doesn't look better when hairstyles like afros and other things like that are put behind in-game currency paywalls and things like that. And they're not available for when you first start. One of the black hairstyles that you have available is dreadlocks, but it's only on women, and then men get like braids, and that doesn't really look black. I mean, I use it because I've sort of finagled it around with my character to look in that aspect. But in terms of like black phenotypical features, the game does not do a great job of showcasing it. Right? There's not the larger noses, the lips, and other things like that. Or just it just doesn't look real. So many of them feel like they're playing, they're just like putting on brown skin. Sometimes just feels like blackface, right? It just feels like a white or
Mm.
Asian character with brown skin rather than any sort of attempt to properly phenotypically display blackness in that case. So a lot of some of them just they don't even try. They're just like, this isn't worth it. This feels offensive in some way. And even then, when you do get the afro, it feels more like a prop than an actual hairstyle. So it's a whole other thing. But they change it up and they do things like create the name of the race escapes me right now. I'll remember it again in a second. But they'll do things like choose the lion race within Final Fantasy because it's a because they're a Leo, and they will do all these other things to aspect themselves because being a Leo is a big part of their personality, and for them that is like their Leoness is inextricable from their blackness, so they will perform this way and with an understanding that if I'm a black individual playing this character and my friends are black and they know I'm black, then this is now a black character, even if it's not visibly black. And it's very similar to the way the black community will claim non-black characters, right? Because there is an understanding of identity and struggle in its creation of blackness where people will resonate with. So Piccolo from Dragon Ball Z. Not technically a black character, but everybody views Piccolo as the black character of Dragon Ball Z because we're not represented, right?
Mm.
There aren't black people there. Same thing with like Sonic the Hedgehog. Knuckles is viewed as the black character, both by the black community and the non-black community, and then confirmed by Idris Elba playing the character in Sonic. Um, in a lot of cases, and this has spiraled out in some weird ways with you've got Knuckles, pre Idris Elba, and other things like that, which is an incredibly racist meme. But we laugh at racist things sometimes. But it's there's an idea the aspects of claiming or finding blackness and in the spaces that didn't allow for it is a part of the black experience. It's a part of what my interlocutors are doing and because they gave them a character creation, selection, they are performing and finding their blackness in all these unique ways that nobody, even black people, wouldn't be able to understand unless you're part of the community. So yeah,
Interesting. Moving on to the policing of blackness within these digital spaces. I know
yeah.
you've written and you do research on this as well.
Mhm.
So if you could also talk about how how that uh, plays out in these communities.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that blackness is policed in some cases, right? Whether or not it's black people policing other forms of blackness, whether or not that be queer black folk or women or other things like that, which we spoke about in that case. There is also the sort of policing that happens. I would put policing of blackness more into in terms of the community, right? Because there's the aspect of ignoring black people or the existence of black people or just not doing them, justice when a game is created. And this is a form of policing in some cases, but if your game doesn't have black people in it, that doesn't make it, a bad game or a racist game, or in many cases, it's just that you have chosen not to, which could have been for a good reason, whether or not it be historical or blah 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 blah. But you know it then forms of blackness, or what's the best way to put that, it's not so much about the forms of blackness, but like the black identity itself, or just being in a sort of policed aspect comes very much from community, right? So you have black people policing blackness of other black folk, which fine. But then you also have the aspect of a type of policing or surveillance that's happening for black folk in these non-black spaces, right?
Mm.
Where having a black name or referencing a black character, or an aspect of black culture, or having being any, or having a a deeper voice that some people might call black, or using uh any sort of black vernacular, will often, these are the ways that people often get routed directly for racism, right? So typically what happens in a game when individuals experience racism, it's either through the callous, or the sort of, how do I put this, open racism that happens every day, right? Like because gaming is viewed as an inherently white space, many of the times it becomes okay, because if I say the N word here, it's just other white people, and they say it in private, or like whatever empowerment that they feel that black individuals aren't there. So you have this sort of wanton use of the N word here, where it's just free, right? I'm just spouting it out. You had no idea I was black. You just said the N word for fun, right? This is just. And then you have the targeted, the direct aspects of racism, where they figure out you're black through some sort of physical artifact, whether or not it be your voice, your name, your character, whatever. And then they target, they begin to shape their insults towards you.
Mm.
Um, and this forms a form of surveillance or policing of identity in a case, because now you as a black individual must now navigate this sort of space, right? You understand that this is a racist space. People are going to use the N-word. People are going to target you. People are going to do all these sort of things. And you now have to perform tactics like black people throughout history, and figure out how you are going to either avoid with this racism, combat this racism, or just overcome it in whatever ways that you figure it out, right? So a lot of the women that I spoke to, some being from a group called Black Girl Gamers, which is a fantastic um black women's gaming group that supports black women within the field, and gamers themselves. you know One of them I was speaking to was like, sometimes I don't even turn on my mic. Sometimes I don't even engage. I basically, unless I'm playing with friends, I treat it like I'm basically playing a solo game, because by the time they hear her talk, both because she is a woman and because she uses black vernacular, they normally figure out that she's black, and then whether or not she's beating them or she's not doing good or anything else like that, the insults become very charged and targeted, right? Like you're this and this because you're a black woman, or you're a monkey, or these other things, right? So that's not something she wants to engage in. And a big aspect of it that I always get asked is like, how do you know that the people that you're interacting with is black, or like how do you know that black people are experiencing this stuff? Because they don't have like these physical, like they're not physical bodies, right? And in many of these cases, um, and that comes down to the fact that the physical and the digital aren't separate, right? They still interact, and there's always a way for people to sort of figure out what you are in some cases, right? If you have a heavy Texan accent, people are going to figure out you're from Texas, and it's vice versa. If you have a heavy like Brooklynite accent, and you use the language and other things like that, people are going to figure it out. And if you're close enough, they're going to target it. And so it's a complete space. It's a complete navigation of what I term in one of my papers called the magic circle of whiteness. um, which is just the formation or the understanding of gaming spaces of being inherently white spaces, both from the people who played and the behaviors that interact with it, forming the anti-blackness within the space, the developers forming, continuously catering to white players, and the sort of lack of diverse games that come out where the heroes are, usually white men in a lot of cases. Um, excuse me, and then the games themselves, the developers making white games, and then the games themselves being, artifacts of whiteness in a lot of cases, right? And this is getting better, thankfully. There's lots of there's not lots, but there are more black examples. There are more examples of solid black, representation within these games. But this sort of triangulation called forms what I call the magic circle of whiteness, and this serves as the background of what like black players are experiencing. So a lot of the policing comes from just the experiences that they've had, and just knowing that, at some point, if somebody figures out who I am, they're going to do some real fucked up shit, and I don't want to deal with that. So it comes from more of a, I don't want to say panopticonic, because I don't want to start talking Foucault, but it's more of just it's an internalization, it's an internalization of the possible racism that forms a specific barrier between the black player and the gaming side itself. So yeah.
Do you think this internalization then also transfers onto how willing a Black community within a digital space is to take on phenotypically, Black traits
Mhm.
on characters? Because when you talk about how certain markers of a race can be used by other people within the white gaming space
Mhm.
to abuse these black communities, do you think that's then creating fear in them to express uh, their blackness in the way that they want to?
So sometimes, right, that this is the treat of research, and one of the things that you have to take in consideration when writing and understanding the space. It's the fact that black individuals aren't a monolith, right? And everybody's going to come up with a different answer in many of these different cases. So yes, some will legitimately experience some sort of distaste or fear that they don't want to interact, and they will make a white character in some cases to just avoid all that, right? And it's always a weird thing, right? Because if you then interact with people in game, and then continue relationships, or play with them for a long time, whatever else, there might come a time where you're going to have to reveal that you're black, and it's a very unique and different way of coming out, in a way, virtually, because as the old adage says, like, nobody knows if you're a dog on the internet in many cases, right? So a way that some individuals protect themselves is, yeah, don't perform or show any forms of blackness, or keep it limited to a certain degree, and at least you will if you're experiencing misogyny, at least it won't be misogynoir, right? If you're experiencing, flaming because of your gameplay, at least it's just, at least it's flaming, and not, flat out racism, right?
Mhm.
There's a limitation to that. But then there are a bunch of folks who are just like, fuck all of them. um, and I'm going to be as blickety black as absolutely possible, and represent themselves through their characters, and do what they have to do, because it's just the reality of the situation, and whether or not it's digital or physical, they're not going to be limited by those individuals. But there's definitely a focus on community building and privatization that builds up a lot in a lot of cases. So I don't think that black individuals are as, so it's different, it's a 50-50. Some people do it, some people don't. But there is a lot of black groups that are formed specifically for blackness, and then they will police their borders
Mm.
for to make sure that non-black individuals. So there are your spaces where it's like they're big enough and everybody can join. Like, you understand that, hey, if you are, supportive of the black community, you're welcome to come in. Bring your white wife, whatever else, do that. But then there's a lot of spaces who will say only black individuals, and they will ask for photographic proof. They will have you fill out a survey. They will
Mm.
form all these levels of, protection, because they know it only takes one troll to come in there to ruin everything, right? To to
Mhm.
to make people feel unsafe in all these other cases. And the last chapter that I wrote in the anthropology in the Routledge Anthropology Media Companion talks about one of the groups that I worked with in my preliminary research who tried an open space group to be like, hey, everybody can come in, but this is a black space. This like we're really here working to make black people feel safe, to make them feel loved within the gaming community and all these other things. And it was just bombarded sometimes daily by trolls who would find the space on Discord and will, come in, scream the N-word a bunch of times, get blocked and head out, right?
Mm.
But by that point, the damage has already been done,
Mhm.
right? You already know that, at any point I'm going to experience this sucks. Now I feel unsafe in this space. And worse yet, there was a lot of, what's the word, negative actors in a lot of cases, that just, there were people that were coming in pretending to be black that would, perform digital blackface or virtual blackface in a lot of cases. And one of the benefits of ethnography is that because you are there for months or years at a time, it means that you stick around long enough to figure this stuff out, right? So the people that you interview or whatever else are engaged with, right? The question of like, how do you know they're black? Was like, well, I was here for 3 months,
Mm.
and a bunch of community folks did the work and found out that this guy wasn't black, that he was pretending to be black, and they have all the evidence from their own court cases or just like going into other chats because it does form a sort of informal network that begins to show up between the other black spaces. Somebody joins one space and then joins another space and then joins another space and then begins to connect them in these sort of weird informal ways that this person got kicked out of that group for pretending to be black, and then the information got passed on to this one and then got passed on to this one, and now we're at this situation. Now we know that you're not black, so what do you have to say for yourself, right? But that group unfortunately didn't last because the idea of keeping the space open for everybody didn't work because in addition to the racism, there were also a lot of white folk and non-black folk that came in there to find their own joy and thing from interacting. There were a bunch of folks just being like, hey, I'm more comfortable around black people, so I
Mm.
joined this group. And then you get enough of those individuals start taking up space, they start redirecting the conversations, they start shifting the politics of the community, and then eventually black people don't feel safe anymore, they're now being undermined, all these other things, and then they start heading out. So once you have a mass exodus of the black folk, which is literally what happened, the group was literally just left with all majoritively white and non-black creators, and eventually the group got passed once the main individual who created the group passed it on to a white Australian dude, who was a big like supporter of the group and other things like that. But once it was no longer a black group, once he left, it was just all the black people left, and that was it, right? Absorbed through the sort of, it was deluged by forms of whiteness, both through um discriminatory practices and of utilization isn't the right word. It's obsession isn't the right word either, of usage, right? Of just using black space and black body for your own gain, right? It was just used up. So yeah.
That's almost like a sort of warfare within a digital space where you have these kind of agents of kind of transmitting racism through digital spaces, coming in, bombarding these marginalized, oppressed communities, the black community, spilling their insults, attempting to disrupt any
Mm,
kind of solidarity they may have. And then you have these, white folk with uh, on the surface, good intentions, slowly weeding out and
mm.
replacing these black communities almost like a kind of colonial endeavor within a digital space.
Yep.
So that is extremely fascinating. Um, I talking about kind of whiteness within digital spaces. You did mention in your talk, in your anthropology talk, about Japanese Europeanness,
Mhm.
and that to me seems like such a fascinating concept. And if you could expand on that, I would be really grateful.
Yeah, so within that talk, right, there's an aspect, right? So a lot of the work, the chapter in the talk talks about the sort of ways in which whiteness operates within gameplay, right? But the immediate pushback that you get is that Final Fantasy is not a US or UK developed or Canadian developed, like any sort of, it's not a white developed game, it's a Japanese game, right? Um, but and that's true, right? And that deserves its own sort of special take in a lot of cases. But what individuals fail to understand is that globalization, right, and the interaction of Japanese culture has had a large influence from US and European aspects, specifically in the realms of gameplay, in that video games, right? A lot of like Final Fantasy and a lot of the MMOs that are developed within Japan, um, are they're taken from US games, right? They get influenced, they're inspired by aspects of WoW and Guild Wars and other games that exist that serve as the inspiration for um many of these other aspects, and more specifically, the ways in which the stories are constructed display a direct Europeanness that really can't be ignored in a lot of cases, right? So on the cover of Final Fantasy 14, the sort of stand-in for the player is a white, blue-eyed, brown-haired man,
Mhm.
right? And that person doesn't look Japanese in the slightest. That doesn't look, well, obviously Japanese is a nationality, and you can look lots of different ways. But in terms of what one would often expect in a stereotypical way, it doesn't match that way. Nor does it match any other race for that thing other than whiteness. And there's an aspect of like, but why? What was the impetus behind that decision, right? And if you're familiar with like Miyazaki films and all these and like other like Studio Ghibli stuff like that, right? Like a lot of their movies are, you know, they're inspired by forms of European storytelling, specifically fairy tales, right? And you see this influence in a lot of different ways in anime and Japanese video games, in so many different ways that it specifically can't be ignored, because when you are, say, a black person in the US playing it, you read it right as a text in a very different way. You understand that this character in Final Fantasy, despite it being made by Japanese, developers, is a white man. When the English translations for the game place everybody with a European, whether or not it be British or Irish or any of the other European accents, right? That is a direct understanding of a form of Europeanness being performed in the game itself, right? And that is when everybody is basically white, when everybody has a sort of European accent, when everybody has this sort of thing, you see this sort of uh, Japanese Europeanness, because it's not directly European. It is what European and U.S. identity looks like through a Japanese cultural lens, right?
Mhm.
It is influenced, because it is also important to remember that Japan has its own direct culture and the way they interact with it. But for some reason, there is a fascination with Europeanness in video games, and it consistently gets to be played out again and again and again. And it's fine, right? Do whatever, make Dark Souls, make Final Fantasy, in many other cases. But as a black player, it then becomes right. Like if it's not, it's one of the arguments is always like, well, Japan is like an isolationist country, and like they only they only work within themselves and all these other things and whatnot. But you know if it's so isolationist, why then are we displaying? Why do we have all these portrayals of whiteness?
Mhm.
Why then must we have the excuses of things like Mokoku Seki, which is the idea of racelessness within anime, um, still perform the ways they do, because Mokoku Seki doesn't work for black people, right? If it's a black character, anime character, it's black. If it's you can get away with like whiteness and other things like that, right? Naruto is supposed to be quote unquote Japanese, but still blonde hair, blue eyed,
Mm.
lots of other cases and things like that. So this sort of Japanese Europeanness that I spoke about within the presentation was more or less accounting for the fact that even when Japanese individuals make Final Fantasy or make the game, that there's still an aspect of whiteness that black players must engage.
Mhm.
So it's in terms of forming, around theorizing around the work, around looking at the games and things like that. There's still very much a sort of black white dichotomy that does not escape. It's just now tinted by the lens of global interpretations of blackness and global interpretations of whiteness, specifically within Japan.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that would make you even more sense if you look at historically Japan being, not only colonized after the war by,
Mm,
the U.S. If you want to use that term,
mhm,
but in general, because the U.S. and generally Western uh, nation states, for example, in Europe, because there's such cultural hegemons, that kind of creates a pervasive colorism I've noticed within, especially Asian countries, not only Japan but China as well. You
Mm.
have these, makeup that tries to whiten skin, and not only Asian countries but Africa. I know there's certain businesses in which they have skin whiteners.
Yes.
And so it's interesting how even how even in digital spaces this becomes this colorism and this cultural hegemony becomes a reality that we have to deal with, and it kind of takes away this any kind of techno utopian notion of like, hey, we can create a virtual space in which it's going to be fully separated from all the problems of the world.
Yeah.
Racism, don't worry about that. Sexism, don't worry about that. Hierarchical economic systems like capitalism, don't worry about that. It's this purification of these digital spaces that is portrayed as by a liberal kind of or neoliberal myth is deceiving, I think.
Yeah, and it entirely is, right? Because there's the fears around technology, go both ways in a lot of cases where it's like you can have this, like you said, techno utopian state where everything is separate is thing, but that idea comes directly with the terms of like separation from the body, of and with separation of the body that tends to follow, separation of physical cultures and all these other things that comes attached to what it is to have a human experience, right? And that's BS, right? You are not separated. You do not cease to be a white man because you logged into World of Warcraft and you picked a torrent, right? You are still that, and that still influences the way you see the world and see life, and it shows up in all these very different ways, because whether or not the creators of the game made it out, or the players of the game have interpreted it, because once an individual makes a game, it's in the world, it takes on a life of its own, right? Just like books are open to multiple interpretations or
Mm,
have multiple uses, games will do the same. um it is important to remember that just because you are online and you have the anonymity doesn't mean that anonymity is the same thing as separation, right? And you can look back and the early 90s and 80s and things like that, about like digital technologies and how it's going to make us as human and robotic and all these other things, right? All these fears, which were obviously now seen to be um unfounded in many cases. It like humans don't technology doesn't make people less human. It just exacerbates or heightens the sense of humanity that it facilitates in many cases. So there is there's a big fear, and in a lot of cases there's a lot of stuff, but yeah, no, yeah, the metaverse isn't going to be some utopia. In many cases, and because technology is made and created by humans who have biases, they're going to contain these biases. There's a reason why tons of cameras, whether or not it be Microsoft Connect or any sort of newer Apple product, has a hard time picking up black faces, because they weren't coded with black people in mind. It's the same way why it's the same reason why there aren't black individuals in a bunch of games you play, because they weren't made by black people and they weren't coded with black people in mind.
mhm.
And there's I remember teaching a class once on race and gaming, and I was just going through the basics of it, and somebody was like, when does it end? Right? Like how, like, does every game need a black person in it and all these other things, right? And I'm just like, no, every game doesn't need a black person in it. I still loved God of War, one without any black people being in it. And Angrboda and her grandmother and Ragnarok was a different one. Visibly, whether or not Kratos is black is a long hot debate, especially within the black community. But when every game continues a pattern of anti-blackness or ignoring black individuals, it it shows who's making them. It ignores the realities of the real world, because black people do exist, right?
Mhm.
It's the same reason why people get upset. It's like when people get upset that there is a LGBTQ character in their game, and then they're like, oh, why is there always gay people in the game? Blah 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 blah. And the people get upset. It's like, well, gay people exist,
Mhm.
right? Trans people exist, right? And because games are made from the imaginations of their players, and you have such a diverse player base playing them, it's important that people do feel represented in many cases. So yeah, I don't need a black person in every game, but when it does happen, I'd like it to be done right.
Mhm. Yeah, I know there's this slippery slope fallacy going through a lot of kind of, is the reactionary rhetoric against a lot of
Oh,
progressive ideas or trying to have representation in games. I know there's a lot of also. There was this one game in which it was to do with like either World War One or World War Two, and they introduced a female character who was on the front lines, and there's this huge outrage by a lot of like uh, pretty kind of sexist groupings that this is not historically accurate, and we shouldn't have any kind of female characters on the battlefield. But you look at history, and women have also been deeply involved
hmm,
in the machinations of wars,
yeah.
also as doctors on the battlefield as well. um, so it's fascinating how you have this dynamic. And there's one more concept I was really interested in discussing, kind of how these ideas of, because I know that a lot of kids and teens and young adults, they come into gaming and they see it as again, escapism. And you've already insinuated that there isn't really an escape from reality. It's very much interwoven. But they come into these ideas of, for example, esports,
Hmm.
and they're like, oh, this is going to be a really great, freeing, liberating kind of time. But I know you've done work on kind of looking at race and labor within esports.
Hmm.
And so I would be very interested in what you've noticed there.
Yeah, so it depends on a lot of things, right? So there's like you said, I've been insinuating, but I can flat out say in a lot of cases gaming isn't escapism. Right. So it also depends on what the person means of escape. Because typically what people mean when they say escapism is like, I don't have to think about the hard day at work because I'm playing. And video games can very much work like that.
Mhm.
But in terms of like being a form of escapism of escaping reality, no, you're like I whether or not I get called the N word, by a truck full of white guys driving down the street or within the game, I'm still being called the N word. Like the ideas of racism or other things like that that some people might look to try to escape, is not escape, right? Maybe perhaps for some other bodies that may be a possibility, but in terms of just like how people relax and don't want to focus on things, games can definitely work as like whatever mind numbing you want it to be. Throw on, I don't know, Bejeweled and just slap away at some jewels, right? Sure. Um, but in terms of the esports labor aspect directly, right? Esports is such a I hate using the term wild west, but it's such a moving and sort of diverse space right now that there's a lot of things happening. So in the esports in the color line article that I wrote, I did speak a lot about labor, specifically around PC gaming, because there's a lack of uh, black individuals being represented within the space for a lot of reasons. And I do a lot of theorization around that and speaking on why that happens, specifically on the forms of historical forms of labor and how Black labor has been utilized, right?
Mm.
Whether or not it be in the overconsumption or the direct survival of labor through things like slavery to do things like build up a capitalistic economy that we now live in today, or blocking Black people from labor because these are access to power, where it's like Black individuals, we're going to block you from coding or from schools that will teach you about internet or computer technologies, right? Because this is a form of work and technology that we want to protect in some cases, right? So there's always been a shifting of what labor Black individuals are able to take on without sort of directly disrupting a larger white hegemonic power structure in a lot of cases, right? So whether or not and you can obviously look through plenty of examples of history of like the barring and accepting of Black labor in many cases, and it takes a lot of work to move that sort of line. So taking that sort of historical understanding of Black labor and then applying that to this esports space in a lot of cases, right? Because Black labor has always been abused in a lot of cases for when it is usable or available in a lot of cases in esports where you don't see any Black people at all. You have to sort of understand like where is the like what is the purpose that's serving in a lot of cases, right? And I go on to talk about how it is, it's for lots of reasons in a lot of cases where not only is games like League of Legends and other PC games harder for Black individuals to access, because of aspects of not having equipment and other things like that, which I hate to talk about because of course Black people own computers and lots of things like that, but it is a realistic aspect of it, of just like computer equipment is expensive, right? So it's one barrier to the gameplay, but also in that the structuring of esport games specifically is not like Black labor is not visible to it, right? In a lot of ways, where the recruitments of star players and other things, because it'll always be like, we'll take the best players. It doesn't matter. Like we don't choose players based on race,
Mm.
but where the recruiters go to recruit, right, is going to have a big influence of it. How these individuals are able to acquire the skill that they have, right? Um, of just being supported. Like lots of Black people just can't go on and play, League of Legends 20 hours a day to be as good as thing, because you have work, you have things there. There are other structural issues beyond gaming that form barriers for Black individuals to be able to participate in a lot of PC gaming. And then the esports structure has not been able to equate itself there yet, because it's just like it's because they work on a system of merit that ignores what Black labor is within the space, right? And it's problematic because you have all these Black folk that are playing the game, that are performing the labor, that are streaming or doing or forming communities within their space that allow other Black people to feel safe, which directly and indirectly makes these companies monies, whether or not it's in WoW or League of Legends or the other things where they're buying skins or paying their monthly purchase, right? That the companies themselves are not doing, whether or not it's like esports systems that are maintained by companies like Riot's Riot's esports section, which they're doing a lot better of a job by trying to work with HBCUs and other things like that to build up their community, or if it's just unnamed communities in other spaces. But the networks themselves of esports labor for PC games specifically, because console games is a very different space, and you have Evo and other things like that where Black people have a big showing out, right? But within PC gaming, and which is often the larger and the higher paid aspects of it, there's a big disconnect of acknowledging Black skill, Black labor, and Black identity within those spaces, and they become very very quickly overpopulated. Overpopulated is not the right word, but completely filled with white and Asian bodies, versus you know, accepting other forms of labor and other cases like that. So there's a lot of things to break down there, and had we the time to break down the sort of PC versus console gaming, and also the sort of irony that a lot of console gamers can never reach the amount of payout that PC gamers can, because they don't have the same amount of leverage. And it's often like Evo is like you enter a tournament, and League of Legends Worlds is you entering a team with lots of sponsors and support and all these other things is very different. But yeah, the usage of Black labor within the space is very interesting to say the least.
Hmm. You have this myth of meritocracy then really
Yes,
animating esports and the esports scene, and of course broader, and it's a broader kind of conception of our society currently. I think it's another kind of nail to really showcase how the digital space isn't away from racism, isn't away
mm,
from these kind of problematic realities of I guess late stage capitalism. Who knows?
the latest.
it's,
But
it's really hard to say. But yeah, you'd have to deal with the systematic inequalities plaguing marginalized communities
mhm,
in order to really have a quote unquote meritocratic system.
exactly.
Um, and it's been a great interview with you. I do have one more question,
Shoot.
leaving it into more of the personal, because we focus on a lot of the kind of your research, but also on external society and culture and media studies.
Mhm.
Um, I am very curious as to where you draw what wells from which wells do you draw your strength from in order to combat the negative realities imposed onto you by external society, of course racism and
Yeah.
toxic masculinity.
Oh, it's just a level of desensitization. Like I said, I grew up as a kid of the internet, right? Like, and these chat rooms get real dark real fast, and I've definitely been on dark sides of the internet, but I am largely immune to a lot of the things people can say. So it's just a level of desensitization. Like I've been, dealing with this my entire life, and whether or not it be physically or digitally, it's not going to change. I hope it does. And but as of now, doing my work, I have so many moments. Every time somebody says something racist to me, I just add it to the tally, write down a little note, and I'm just like, okay, this person said I smell like a nigger. This person said I smell like blah blah blah. This person decided to harp on A, B, and C. This person decided to throw the match because I had a black avatar, right? There's always something to think about, and it's I do have an impetus to want to see the space become better in a lot of cases, but it's just a day to day. I'm not going to let people's disgusting behavior ruin what I want to do for a living, and the enjoyment that I get from interacting with so many wonderful black folk, and not only black folk but everybody who's out here just making beautiful art, and creating these beautiful communities on space, because we've talked a lot about the racism, a lot about the terrible aspects of the thing, but there is a lot of joy, there is a lot of wonderful things happening within these space, whether or not it be the vulnerability or the finding help or the coping or all these other aspects of it. People really are there for each other, and there are wonderful people like another one of my advisors, Kishana Gray and Javon Gord, and all these other people that are writing specifically on black joy, because right, we are returning to these spaces for a reason, right? There is a lot of love to be had within gaming sites, and I do think it's incredibly important to focus on them, even though the conversation is always drawn, directly towards the friction, towards the aspects of like, how are you dealing with racism, rather than like, how are you, just loving your community, sort of thing. But yeah.
So if you had let's say, a young child or a teenager or a young adult come to you and ask you what should they do when they're experiencing these kinds of insults within these digital spaces, or even outside of the digital spaces, what kind of advice would you give to them to deal with it?
Yeah, so I do. I have two daughters, so that's one thing. And when they begin, exploring the internet, which will inevitably happen on their own, it's to remember that these things do exist, and it's common, and every black person has to have the be careful, the police may treat you this way, or your coworkers may do this, or the school classmates in school will say this sort of thing. And I remember my daughter coming home when a boy told her that he didn't play with brown girls.
Mm.
And my advice was to understand that the world can be a crappy place, and that people are going to do things like that, but those actions don't define you. And to take the precautions, right, of just like always be aware of what can happen, and that again, these actions don't define you, and that you will be great and whoever you are, despite what people will say. So it's unfortunately, I can't say like, hey, there's a magic way to avoid racism, but find your community, find the places where you do feel safe and comfortable, and leverage that as best you can, because it, the world gets rough, and there's not there's this is why people are doing the work, but there's not much else to do, unfortunately. So yeah, the companies are not at the level to be able to well, I mean, they could, but they don't. So
Mm.
there's not enough structural support, whether or not it be gaming or outside, to start making the changes that you would like to see. So it's my advice is find your community, and remember, it's not you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much,
Of course.
Akil. This has been an amazing conversation. I have learned a lot, and I know that the audience has probably learned a lot as well.
I
It
hope
has
so.
been a great pleasure to have you on. I'm very grateful. Thank you again. And if you do have any links you want to put in or any kind of books or articles you want to advertise, now is also the
Oh
chance.
man, I there's so much. There's so many people doing great work. Check out Kishona Gray, check out Javon Gore, check out Samantha Blackman, check out all of the wonderful Black scholars working on games. And beyond that, there's just wonderful stuff to read. You're interested in digital anthropology. Check out Tom Bilstuff and all that stuff. But as for me, my name is fairly Googleable. There's not too many Akils. Um, so Akil Fletcher. I think I'm on Twitter. I am at Akil Fletcher, which because I'm basic, very simple. Um, and I think yeah, that's about it. Enjoy.
All right, thank you so much.
Of course.